Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And renewable clean energy, Egypt has a very natural potential to become one of the world's greatest, strongest energy players, as it is very well positioned with the main natural elements to develop an abundance in energy: sunlight, wind and hydro energy. And of course, today we're delighted to be joined in the studio by our guest, engineer Mohammad Makhlouf, the solar energy expert. A very good afternoon to you, sir, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you.
Right. Now let's start, Mr. Mohammad, by discussing how far is Egypt qualified, in your opinion, to be a producer of solar energy and a main energy player in the region?
Well, in terms of resources, solar energy primarily relies on the sun.
Of course.
And Egypt, in that sense, is very highly qualified, of course. The other element that goes into it is the availability of space and area and the availability of a market to consume the product. Along those two lines, we are quite privileged. In fact, we do have vast desert areas and we have a population and a big consumer market. So in reality, in terms of resources, we are well positioned in that respect. Comes the actual functioning of the solar industry. The industry relies on certain technologies that have to be produced and then certain systems that have to be integrated and installed. In terms of production, the main component of the solar system is the solar panel, and that is already being produced in Egypt, albeit not in enough capacity to cover the market needs, but that should change with time as the manufacturers in Egypt develop volume. And then the remaining elements, they can be produced in Egypt. It's not necessary that they be produced at this point. However, they can be produced in Egypt. There's nothing to hold us back. And then comes the system integration, the production of an entire system that delivers solar energy. And we do have the expertise for that.
So what's the challenge? What's the problem?
Right.
Is it the expense? Is it expensive to produce and use solar energy? Because as you said, there's nothing really holding us back.
Yes. Well, you have to understand that, first of all, the fact that our power costs were subsidized until recently meant that the economics of solar wasn't quite appealing. Now the situation has changed, so we are going to see a gradual increase in the use of solar energy. The main challenge is the fact that any solar system involves a certain capital expenditure, a certain amount of money that has to be invested at the beginning, with the privilege that there will be very little, if any, running cost thereafter.
Okay.
So this model in itself sometimes appeals and sometimes doesn't, depending on cash availability. So the challenge can be well faced if the financial institutions get their act together and start aligning themselves with the solar projects so that they can finance and stagger the expense or amortize it over a certain period of time. Then it becomes quite affordable for whoever it is who is using the product. That applies across the board, throughout all industries, all sectors.
All right. Now, Mr. Mohammad, the government has launched a number of projects recently with the promise to provide the needed amount of clean and renewable solar energy, of course. How has this come along and what progress are we making in this arena?
So the most publicized solar project in Egypt is the one in the south of Egypt called Binban project. It's an area close to Aswan called Binban. And there the government has allocated a big piece of land to hopefully develop some solar stations, or solar park if you wish, or a solar farm if you wish as well, amounting to about 1.8 gigawatts of potential power delivery to the grid, to the national grid. That is the most publicized project, and if it does materialize, then obviously we have a big solar park in hand. That project was developed over two phases. Phase one, which has been closed, and hopefully projects are working there already. Well, I think one of the stations has been already delivered, and it's developed in 50 megawatt stations. Phase two is already been awarded and assigned, and I believe it should also follow track, and I believe the entire farm should be ready in 2 or 3 years. Now, that is the most publicized thing, but however, there is much more potential than that in Egypt.
Of course.
You have to maybe note that there are several sectors that can privilege from solar energy immediately. Although it's not very intuitive, but the biggest market that can actually develop solar usage is the residential market, the rooftops of villas in compounds and houses and standalone units. There is also the agricultural sector that can benefit from that in terms of the pumps that are used in agriculture, whether submersible pumps or surface pumps, pivot systems for irrigation, hangars for poultry, for example, fertilizer plants. All these kind of agricultural installations can benefit from solar. Then comes the industrial sector. All factories, hangars, warehouses, all of these are potential recipients of solar power systems. You have the commercial sector. You're talking about the hotels, the malls, the hospitals, the private schools. This is the commercial sector. And they are in deep need of that because of the recent increase, exactly, the increases in power costs. And then the infrastructure sector. You're talking about street lighting, you're talking about bus stations, you're talking about airports, train stations. All of these installations can benefit from solar. So although Binban and the solar park is very well publicized, the potential for the market is much wider than that.
So in your opinion, how far along are we in reaching the spread of solar energy usage to even, as you mentioned, unexpected places like individual homes, for example?
Yeah. So what I'm going to tell you is my opinion, of course. But if you take it on a scale of 0 to 100, where are we on that scale? I say we are about at 1 or 1.5. Meaning, no, that's not bad news. It means that there's a lot of potential ahead of us to go and deliver more and more of this value to the Egyptian economy and to the functioning of the Egyptian society.
So when this technology started becoming more popular, the main issue was the fact that it was very expensive, an expensive kind of technology. But as you said, now things are changing, and as electricity is no longer subsidized as was before, people might shift their focus. Now, are there alternatives to expenditure on this kind of energy? As you said, we are already producing some of the parts here in Egypt. Others we're importing. Some people say that Chinese imports are cheaper than the original imports from Europe, etc. How far is this when it comes to truth?
Well, okay, so let me take you through this piece by piece. First of all, yes, it has always been historically very expensive, but it's taken a very steep dive in cost in the last 10 years. So in the last 10 years, the cost of a solar system has gone down about 4.5-fold. If you wish. So it used to be like $4 per watt. Today we're talking about 0.85 of a dollar, something like that. Part of that comes from the fact that the Chinese have been indeed flooding the market with products, and they have been flooding them with very dumped and depressed prices. I would advocate that even unreasonably so, to an extent. And why am I saying that? Is because some of the very Chinese companies themselves were driven into bankruptcy as a result of these prices. Not so much Europe and the US alone, but actually China. So that has driven the prices down, okay? Still, it remains that you do have to put some investment into this, which is not very obvious to the user. And again, I repeat, this is where financing comes into it. And if you do finance and are able to finance at reasonable interest rates the system over a reasonable period of time, which more or less matches the payback period for a system like that, then you are going to produce a hype in this industry in Egypt. I believe that 4 or 5 year financing terms is quite reasonable. I believe that interest rates less than about maybe between 5 to 10% is also very reasonable. If banks and financial institutions are willing to invest in those systems along those lines, then I believe you will have exponential growth in Egypt for this. So.
Indeed. Now, Mr. Mohammad, Egypt is also producing other sources of energy like wind and hydroelectric energy, etc. How important is it to diversify our sources of energy, not relying on the usual traditional sources of non-renewable energy?
Well, I mean, it speaks for itself, of course. Fossil fuels are something that is becoming more and more frowned upon worldwide because of its environmental impact and because of its limited availability as well. I have spent a big part of my life in the oil and gas industry, so I'm a fossil fuel man essentially, but I'm a convert to renewables recently. I'd say that this limited availability story is not exactly holding water because there is lots of resource in the earth. God has created the earth very big. So it's not so much availability, it's the environment and the economics of usage. So oil and gas. Oil industry, if you want to use crude oil as a fossil fuel resource, it's not very economic, it's not very smart. Actually, the biggest profits you make out of crude oil is in the petrochemical industry. So if you divert the places that used to use crude oil products for energy generation and use renewable or other alternative sources, that's a very intelligent economic strategy, apart from its environmental angle as well. Now, you spoke about wind and you spoke about hydro. Hydro, we do have the Nile and we do have the Aswan High Dam, and that's basically it in terms of hydropower. Not like other places in Africa where you have waterfalls and mountainous terrain and things like that. But wind is certainly another element to the equation that is very promising in Egypt, because we do have, for the most part, flat land, and we have very windy places, and we have vast exposed areas. In my view, in about 10 to 15 years' time, the ideal system would be a hybrid of three things: a solar system along with a wind system along with a storage system. These three together, in my view, and with the evolution of technology, will probably totally replace a fossil fuel-based generation system, even for big power-consuming installations, as I see the technology evolving. And I'm saying in about 10 to 15 years.
So solar and wind, I understand. Storage. Yes.
Okay, so you see, solar has the limitation of operating only during daylight.
Yes.
Wind has the limitation of depending on the wind gusts and the wind profile, the speed and things like that. So what do you do in cases of lapse of both? You have to have something to back you up. So the hybrid, the design comes into this. You hybridize those two together and apply or include an element of storage to take care of those lapses. And between the three of them, you can cover 24 hours a day, 365 days a year with no trouble.
That would be the ideal.
That would be the ideal.
The ideal model,
yes.
right. Now, let's talk a bit about self-sufficiency when it comes to energy in Egypt. How far are we in achieving self-sufficiency? We have made quite a few explorations, for example, the latest exploration, Mediterranean, Zohra gas field, etc. How far are we in terms of reaching that aim?
No, I think self-sufficiency is not so much the issue for us, because we do have, for example, if you talk about the electric grid, with all the power plants that are being introduced, we're fine. I mean, we have, in fact, probably in a few years, we will have excess supply of electricity. And if you're talking, that's because we're talking energy. Now, if you're talking about other petroleum products or gas or the likes of that, of course, with the Zohra field, we will have a great deal of gas available. Originally, the Nile Delta and that north of Egypt has always been very rich in gas. Shortage of gas has also, although we did import some and export some, but you know, the oil and gas industry is more complex than that. There are always deals. It's not so much that we needed that in order to do that. There are deals. It's not self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is not something that worries me. We have enough resource. It's a matter of economics. Gas, for the most part, is, in my view, is best utilized if it's exported. You will get the best economics out of that. And in terms of energy, I think we have enough with what we have, and we can do a lot more.
Right. Let's also talk about the importance of the prices, the pricing system. Now, with the recent changes in the subsidies, etc., do you think people are becoming more aware of the fact that you mentioned it's a no-cost running system? You won't have
low cost, very low cost.
So the main bulk of the money will go into the installation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, what does the cost actually for the running entail? How does it calculated?
Okay, so there are two main paradigms in this. One that involves storage, electricity storage, which means having batteries, and one that doesn't. If we talk about the one that doesn't, which is the one that has the biggest potential of spreading out, then the only maintenance you need to do would be the cleaning of the panels, glasses. That's all. Apart from the fact that in about 5 to 7 years, you would maybe need to change the inverter or change some of the electronic components. But other than that, there's no maintenance. There's nothing there at all. Now, if you do have batteries in the system, then depending on the type of batteries that you deployed and their lifetime, you may need to replace batteries periodically. But again, that's all. There's nothing else to it. It's not like a diesel system, for example, where you'd have to change filters and do some overhauling and maintenance and have some backup infrastructure and do fueling. I mean, it's nothing like that.
Let's talk a bit also about the spread of electric cars.
Yes.
There is a move for countries to turn to electric cars, and Egypt is joining. I believe there was an electric car refilling station that was recently opened, etc. How important is this? Do you see this as another way of using different kinds of energy?
Of course, I believe that going electric in general for vehicles, whether it is cars, small pickups, bikes, motorbikes, is a very intelligent thing to do. The thing about this is that it does require government to set policy in order for this to function. Nothing of that will be commercial unless it has enough volume. And for this to have enough volume, then you have to have the government behind it, because you need to have infrastructure set up for it. You need to have the streets designed to accept things like that. You need to have those filling stations, which are now equivalent to the gas stations, of course, for charging. You have to have a grid that feeds onto them, or apply solar systems so that you could use them to feed or to recharge cars. So it's a shift in paradigm. It's a social restructuring in our society and in all societies. And I believe that this does require government backing, but it also requires people behind it to be feeling responsible for that.
So you said it's a paradigm shift.
Yes.
So Mr. Mohammad, do you see moves being done to introduce this paradigm shift? What steps need to be done from even a young age in schools, for example, to start this idea that renewable energy, etc., there is a different source of energy?
Yes. I believe actually schools are already assuming that role. I believe the young generation is much more aware and conversant with renewable energy than our generation or my generation is. And so I'm quite happy about that.
Right.
So yes, this kind of awareness needs to be instilled in the young generation. And as they grow, they will be navigating easily with this. Now it
won't be new.
Sorry?
It won't be new.
No, it won't be new. It already isn't, by the way. When you talk to any young kid, you'll find them very conversant with this.
Indeed.
And I think that even with moving vehicles, eventually what you will see is a hybrid between a battery in the car, a solar system, and also some wind power generation. Because as the car moves, you do have wind, right? So you can generate something out of that.
Absolutely. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Mr. Mohammad Makhlouf, the solar energy expert, I'd like to thank you very much, sir, for coming in today and for your insight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sir. And ladies and gentlemen, we wrap up today's edition of Cairo Local Time. You're in the company of Angie Meher. Many thanks for joining us.